Welcome to Fridays with a Forester. Today is Friday the 13th, February 13th, 2026. Stewardship strategies for resilient forests is our topic today. Your host today is myself, Gary Wyatt, extension educator with our forestry team based out of Mankato Regional Office, and Lauren Backus, our regional support staff at Andover. She's been helping us along the way the last couple of years and a very good asset to have on a webinar. Today's topic and speaker is Stewardship Strategies for Resilient Forest. Anna Stockstead, part of our Extension Forestry team with the University of Minnesota Extension. She's based out of our Cloquet office. She'll be our speaker today. A couple of noteworthy items. We will have some chat going on. We'll post some web links that Anna will be talking about during her presentation. But if you want to ask questions in the Q&A section, please do. And then all of our recordings are recorded on a Z-link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. That's our YouTube University webpage that we have these recordings recorded at. Anna, I'm going to stop sharing and then you can start.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary, for the introduction. And thank you, Gary and Lauren, for hosting. You should be seeing my slides now.
Yes, very good.
Wonderful. So thank you, Gary, for the introduction. Like he said, my name is Anna Stockstad. I am an extension forester with University of Minnesota Extension. I'm based at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And today I'm really excited to be talking to you about stewardship strategies for resilient forests. And I'm hoping that these strategies and concepts that I'll be talking about today can be applicable to you, whether you steward just a couple acres of backyard woods or a larger forested properties like 200 plus acres. And I recognize today is Friday the 13th, but I'm going to choose to celebrate Galentine's Day instead. If anyone is a Parks and Rec fan, I just wanted to call that out here. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today, first, we're going to be talking about what exactly does forest resilience mean. I'm going to be providing that definition. And then I'll also be asking you to consider what it means to you as a land steward, because resilience is going to look a little bit different to all of us. And then I'll talk about the different factors that impact the vulnerability of our forests and really why we should care about promoting the resilience of our forests in the long term. And then finally, I'll share some strategies that you can use, again, regardless of the size of land that you're stewarding. I'll share these strategies that you can use to promote the long-term resilience of your forest ecosystems that you care for. So I'll start first by defining what we mean by resilience. And resilience is a term that is used a lot in the climate space when we're talking about infrastructure, or we can even use it when we're referring to ourselves. We can talk about what it means to be resilient people. But today I'm going to be talking specifically about what it means to be a resilient forest. And this is the ecological definition of forest resilience. It just means it's the capacity of a forest to respond to a disturbance by resisting stress and recovering quickly. What I mean by disturbance, and I'll be talking more about this here in a few slides, but what I mean by disturbance is something that places stress on a forest. So this could be a drought, it could be a bark beetle outbreak, it could be flooding, etc. Anything that places this stress on a forest. But a resilient forest is able to go through that disturbance, whatever it may be, and it's still able to look relatively the same, maintain its core identity and integrity. So it's going to be able to function the same and provide all the same values and services that forests provide. And so when we're promoting this long-term resilience, we're maintaining that core identity and integrity of our forests in the long term. But of course, that's a pretty technical definition. And really, in practice, forest resilience is going to look different to all of us as land stewards. We all have different goals and values when it comes to the ways that we're stewarding and caring for the land and connecting with the land. So at the end of this presentation, I'll be talking about how you can set goals as land stewards, thinking about short-term and long-term goals for promoting that forest resilience. But here, as we're starting to think about those goals and what resilience means to us as land stewards, I want you to consider a few things in the context of the land that you're caring for or stewarding. So first, what do you most value about your woods? Maybe you really value being able to connect with your family out in the woods. Maybe you're a hunter. Maybe you really enjoy bird watching and seeing biodiversity and identifying all the different plants in your woods. How do you connect with your woods? What is that relationship that you have with your woods? And finally, again, what are your goals, whether those are short-term or long-term goals? And like I said, I'll be talking more about this goal setting later on in the presentation. But as we move forward, thinking about resilience, I want you to think about it not only using that ecological definition, but also thinking about it in the context of what it means to you as a land steward. I want to emphasize here too, when I'm saying land stewardship, is that we can all be land stewards. You don't need to own a forested property to be a land steward. Just being an active caretaker of the land in any form makes you a steward. So now that we've defined exactly what we mean by resilience and we've laid that groundwork, now I want to provide some of the context for why we should care about promoting the long-term resilience of our forests. And you may be thinking, well, I mean, forests have always gone through disturbances and they've always had stress in the long term. And it is true that disturbances are an essential part of the life cycle of forests. Disturbances shape the forest that we know today. Disturbance is a natural part of these ecosystems. And these disturbances come in many different forms. So it could be blowdown events, like what I'm showing here in the upper left-hand corner. It can be insect and disease outbreaks, can be fire. Fire is an integral part of many of our forested ecosystems in Minnesota, especially our fire-dependent forests in the northern part of the state. And then also disturbances such as flooding from ecosystem engineers like beavers play a big role in shaping the identity of forests as we know them today. So disturbances are just one part of the life cycle of forests where this disturbance happens. It's followed by regrowth and mortality, and that cycle continues through time. So disturbance is an integral part of the forest as we know them today. But there are some factors that in present day are placing extra stress on our forests that we want to be considerate of, and these have big impacts on the vulnerability of our forests in the long term. Some of these factors are invasive species, including invasive plants, one of which is buckthorn, which I'm sure many of you on this call today have dealt with or are currently dealing with in your woods. Buckthorn is an introduced invasive species, meaning it is not native to Minnesota, and it does a great job of outcompeting our native plants and native trees. And so this has big impacts on the resilience of our woods because it increases the vulnerability of our ecosystems by reducing that native species diversity. We also have native insects that impact our forests. One of them is eastern larch beetle. So eastern larch beetle is a native insect that feeds on tamarack in northern Minnesota. So this is a native insect, but the issue here is that typically eastern larch beetle is able to produce one generation of offspring per year. But recent research has shown that with climate change, as we're getting longer growing seasons, warmer growing seasons, eastern larch beetle is now able to produce two generations of offspring per growing season. So this means that there's more eastern larch beetle on the landscape and more damage to tamarack. And so this is the intensification of these impacts through time from this insect. This is impacting the vulnerability of these tamarack forests in northern Minnesota. There are also other factors such as non-native diseases and insects that are impacting our forests across the state. One of these is oak wilt that I'll just mention, but my colleague Grace Haynes will be talking more about this in a future webinar. Oak wilt is a disease caused by a non-native fungus that impacts all of our native oak trees. So this is something that we need to keep on our radar because it is impacting the resilience of our forests, but there are stewardship and management strategies that we can take to promote the resilience of oak trees to oak wilt. A big topic right now is emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer is, again, an invasive insect. So it is not native to Minnesota. It was introduced here. And all of our native ash trees are highly susceptible to emerald ash borer, or we call it EAB. And in Minnesota, we have a significant amount of ash trees. We have 1 million acres of ash, and a lot of that is black ash in ash wetlands. And the issue here is a lot of these ash wetlands have only black ash as the primary canopy species. And so this is really concerning when we're thinking about vulnerability and resilience, Because if emerald ash borer were to come into these black ash stands and kill off all of those ash trees, there's not a whole lot left in that canopy to take the place of black ash. And so this is telling us that there are steps that we could take to promote the resilience of these woods in the event that EAB were to come in and kill off that black ash. And so I'll be talking more about this later on when we're thinking about strategies. But having diversity in our forests is really essential for promoting the resilience of our woods. And I use this ash example just as an example because black ash and other ash species are really, really important species, both ecologically and culturally. And so there are important steps that we can take to promote the resilience of these stands so that these ash wetlands can still maintain their core functioning in the long term with emerald ash borer. So now I've mentioned this a couple times, thinking about climate change and how that impacts our forests. I could spend a whole presentation talking about this, but I'm just going to mention it here on this slide so that we can use it to inform our management strategies when we're thinking about resilience. And then I'll encourage you to go to the U of M Climate Adaptation Partnership website, which I'll link here shortly, where you can learn more about observed and projected climate change in Minnesota, including regional summaries. But just to summarize what we have observed in terms of climate change and what is projected to occur, we have observed an increase in average yearly temperatures since the beginning of the 1900s, and this trend is projected to continue through the end of the century. We're also seeing warming winters and changes in seasonal extremes. I think all of us across the state are seeing this today and this week, where we're getting really abnormally warm temperatures for mid-February. So we're seeing changes in the length of our winter seasons. We're getting warmer temperatures during the winter and more freeze-thaw events. And so these have impacts on our forested ecosystems. We've also observed, and we are projected to continue seeing an increase in average yearly precipitation. So this is the amount of rainfall, snow throughout the year. But how this precipitation is actually occurring isn't just more consistent rainfall throughout the year. Instead, we're going to be seeing what we're calling weather whiplash, and we have experienced this over the last several years, especially. Weather whiplash is where we're getting more precipitation as single rainfall events separated by these longer dry periods. So this is a lot of rain occurring in a short period of time, and then it's separated by these longer periods of drought or dry periods. And so again, like I mentioned, if you want to learn more, you can go to the Climate Adaptation Partnership website, which we'll send here in the chat. That's just climate.umn.edu. And you can find regionally specific climate summaries through their website. But again, I just wanted to mention this because this climate change is really important when we're thinking about the planning for the long-term resilience of our woods, because this is a major factor that impacts the vulnerability of our forests. All right, so now I've walked through all of that context. We talked about what resilience means, both as a definition, what it means to us. We thought about these different stressors that impact the vulnerability of our forested ecosystems. Now I want us to walk through some key stewardship strategies that you can implement to promote the resilience of your woods. Again, regardless of if you have backyard woods or a larger forested property, I hope that these strategies can be downscaled or upscaled to meet your needs. So I'm going to summarize these strategies into three broad categories that make up this definition, or that help us to meet the needs or meet the objective of managing for resilience. This first major strategy is just called knowing your woods and making a plan. And I'll talk more about this in a slide or two. The second strategy is going to be focused on building diversity and complexity in your woods. And then finally, that third strategy is focused in on reducing and managing stress as much as possible in your woods. And then when you look at this, you might think like, this isn't too different than strategies that I would think about implementing to try to be a more resilient person. Because it's important to know yourself and have a good relationship with yourself, to surround yourself with community, and to try to reduce and manage stress. So like I was saying earlier, resilience is a term that's used in a lot of different spaces, but we can see some of these similarities of like, regardless of if we're talking about forests or if we're talking about being resilient humans. But starting first with knowing your woods. Knowing your woods is the first essential step in building this long-term plan for resilience in your woods. And a great way to do this is to document what grows in your woods, the different trees and plants that you're seeing, as well as all the different wildlife and other beings that are using those trees and plants in your woods. And then I encourage you, if you're able to observe changes through the seasons. So to try to get out in your woods throughout the seasons. So get out there in the winter and the fall and the summer, etc. And seeing how that forest changes through time. Because there might be a lot that we're missing if we're not looking. And I'll show some pictures here in a couple minutes, but there are so many beautiful changes that we can see throughout the year. And so just mindfully observing is really important for building this relationship with your woods. And as land stewards, a lot of the times caring for our woods is a family affair. And so I encourage you to get your loved ones involved, your friends and your family. Maybe that's getting out in the woods together and pulling buckthorn or, getting together and learning how to identify these trees and plants and creating this documentation of what you can find in your woods. Getting those around you involved in caring for the land is really important to developing this relationship with your woods. And so, as I keep saying, the goal here is to build this personal relationship with your woods. And it's really about reciprocity, where the land provides us with these different values and services. And at the same time, we are also caring for it. So, it's this reciprocal, personal relationship that we're building with our land. And this is that essential first step in creating a plan and implementing these stewardship strategies to promote the long-term health and resilience of your woods. And there are many different ways that you can get out there and document what's growing and what you're seeing in your woods. There are many different field guides available to you to identify the different trees and plants growing in your woods. There are many different field guides for birds, mammals, fungi, lichen, etc. So if you're really into having a hardcover or a hard copy of a field guide, just getting out there and sitting in the middle of the woods and identifying, I encourage you to do that. There's also some really great digital tools that we can use to document what we're seeing in our woods. One of them is iNaturalist. This is a participatory science tool that you can use to identify and document what you're seeing in the landscape. And you can use this for all types of species, whether those are plants or animals, fungi, etc. iNaturalist is also a great tool just to keep a running log of what you're seeing in your woods throughout the seasons. And again, when we're focused on mindfully observing what's in our woods throughout the seasons and we're building that personal relationship, we might see some things that we haven't seen before. So this is a picture from the Cloquet Forestry Center from last spring of twin flower, Linnea borealis, which is one of my favorite understory plants. It's a tiny, little, beautiful pink flower, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And even in the winter, you might see things that you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking again, like seeing the beautiful pattern of the shadows of trees on the snow, seeing the birds and listening to the birds in the winter. There are lots of different things that you can see if you just focus on observing and building that relationship with your woods. And so now that we're focused on building this relationship, if we don't already have that relationship, it's really important to make a plan, but be flexible. Having this long-term plan is really important for when we're thinking about those stewardship strategies to promote resilience, because forests live for much longer than humans do. And so it's really important that we create this plan so that we can know what we're going to do down the line and what future generations can do to support the health and resilience of those woods. And the point about being flexible is important too, is because we know we need to be able to adapt to any changes that occur. So maybe a blowdown happens or an insect outbreak happens. Being flexible to any changes that may occur is an important part of stewardship planning. So as we're thinking about developing a plan, first consider your short and long-term goals for your woodland. So for example, maybe in the short term, you really want to focus on reducing the amount of buckthorn on your property. In the long term, a goal could be to have a really diverse forest canopy with a diverse understory with native plants. These are a couple examples of short and long-term goals. Secondly, consider what you want your woodland to look like in the future. So think about future generations and what you would want that woodland to look like for them, what type of values you would want that woodland to provide in the future, 100, 150, 200 years down the line. And then finally, think about the legacy of your woodland. For a lot of folks, like I mentioned earlier, caring for the land is a family affair. So you might be thinking about leaving that land for your children or for your grandchildren or other loved ones. So think about that long-term legacy of your woodland and what you want it to be looking like and providing further down the line. And so I really recommend, if you are able to look into getting a stewardship plan written. And you can find a list of stewardship plan writers for all counties in the state through the Department of Natural Resources website using this Z-link or QR code. This will get you connected with a natural resource professional who can help walk you through these different considerations of what are your goals, what do you most value, what are your core objectives, and they will help you get a stewardship plan written so that you can clearly outline this is what I'm going to do in the short term versus the long term, and just putting all that information into one plan. This is a really useful resource that I highly recommend. All right, so that was our first of three core strategies for promoting resilience. Now I'm going to move into some of these management strategies that we can use to build diversity and complexity in our woods. And this is a core part of resiliency when we're thinking about diversity and complexity. And diversity and complexity come in a few different forms that I'm going to summarize here, and then I'll talk about those management strategies that we can use to promote diversity and complexity. First, we have species diversity. This just includes having a variety of different tree and plant species growing together in our woods. And when we have a variety of tree and plant species, this will also support a high diversity of wildlife and other beings in our woods. We also have age class diversity. So just like humans, trees play different roles throughout their lifetime. And so it's really important to have a variety of different tree ages in our stand because all those different ages are providing different benefits to all the different beings that are using them. And then finally, another key piece of this is called structural diversity or structural complexity. And this just means having different sizes and shapes of trees. So all these different trees have different growth forms. Some have cavities or crooks that can be used for wildlife. But this also includes having dead standing trees, which we also call snags, or deadwood. And deadwood is just the downed dead logs on the forest floor that provide benefits for wildlife. And I'll be talking more about that specifically here in a few slides. But as we're thinking about species diversity specifically, so promoting a diversity of trees and plants in our woods, I want to recommend a resource called Climate Ready Woodlands, which some of you may have heard me or one of my colleagues talk about before. So this is an extension program where we have created recommendations for all 11 ecoregions of the state. And these recommendations include climate-ready native tree species, climate-ready native understory plants that also provide benefits to critters. And then we also have recommendations for ways to steward tree species that may be more vulnerable to the changing climate. And for each of these ecoregions, we also have participatory science projects to study near native tree species. So these are species that are native just south of us, but could do well in our future climate in that particular ecoregion. So this is a great resource for you to refer to if you're thinking about planting some different species of trees. And of course, you want to make sure that you're planting whatever is going to work well on the site. And so I recommend working with a natural resource professional. And this is also where just knowing your woods comes into play and observing the species that are already on site to think about what else could grow there. And I want to emphasize here the importance of species diversity. So biodiversity is often referred to as an ecosystem's insurance policy. And that's because when we think of biodiversity in an ecosystem, we can view it as this type of pyramid where down at the base, we need to have this strong foundation with a diversity of trees and plants, because those tree and plant species are really forming pretty much the foundation of a house. And if we don't have a strong foundation for our house, we're going to be much less stable in the long term if we get, a strong windstorm or any of these other disturbances that may be trying to blow our house down, if we continue to use that analogy. So we want to build that strong foundation by having a high diversity of trees and plants, which will then subsequently support a high diversity of insects, birds, mammals, and other beings in our woods. And I always like to emphasize too that when we have above ground biodiversity, this directly supports below ground biodiversity as well, because soils are entire ecosystems of their own, and they're innately connected to the above ground forest as well. And so when we are supporting above ground biodiversity and having a diversity of trees and plants and other beings, we're also going to be supporting a high diversity of all the different soil organisms that live below ground as well. So it's this really close interconnected relationship between those two parts of the ecosystem. All right, so I'm talking about species diversity and planting trees if you're able to, or promoting the species that are already on site. But if you're looking into planting some trees, where can you get tree seedlings? There are a few different resources that you can go to. The first one would be going to your local soil and water conservation district. They have yearly tree and plant sales, many of which are probably open right now for purchasing tree seedlings. This is a great option because they sell tree seedlings in smaller bundles. So think about 25 seedlings, for example, per bundle. This is going to be different than going through the state forest nursery, where you're only able to get tree seedlings in larger bundles of 100 or more, for example. So depending on your situation, you might want to be getting smaller bundles, in which case going through the soil and water conservation districts would be a great option. There are also private nurseries where you can purchase trees, as well as nonprofits such as Let's Plant Trees that provide free tree seedlings as well. So we're lucky here in Minnesota that we have a lot of different great options for you to go to purchase these tree seedlings. But okay, so now we're maybe buying some tree seedlings with the goal of promoting species diversity for long-term resilience, but the work isn't over yet. If those tree seedlings that you're planting are just getting eaten by deer, then we're not getting the next generation of trees growing up into the canopy. And we want to make sure that we're promoting that growth and getting the next generation of trees to establish to support our long-term resilience. And so protecting seedlings is going to be important, especially for species such as white pine or cedar or oaks that deer really love to munch on. And just to summarize, there are a few different strategies that you can use to protect seedlings in your woods. One is a bud cap, which I'm showing here on the left. You can use this on conifers, where you just staple a piece of paper over the terminal bud, so that's the main bud at the top of the conifer. Just staple a piece of paper over the terminal bud of the tree to protect it from deer browse. Deer can just pull this off, so you might need to go back and replace some of the bud caps, but this is a pretty low cost option for you to protect conifer seedlings. There are also tree tubes, for example, that you can use to protect tree seedlings. These are going to be more costly than just a piece of printer paper for the bud cap, but those are much less easily damaged by deer. And so this could be a good option as well. There's also options such as deer exclosures. So these are just deer fences that protect a bigger area. So you'd put this up, around a couple acre area or however big you want to make it. That would prevent deer from getting in and browsing on the tree seedlings in that area. So you have a few different options when it comes to protecting your seedlings. Okay, so we walked through species diversity and how we can promote species diversity. Now I want to touch on that structural component of thinking about pretty much dead wood, those dead standing trees, dead logs, etc. So dead logs, I just encourage you to leave these behind. And if it's a bigger diameter downed dead tree in the woods, leave it behind. This is going to provide great habitat for birds, mammals, insects, etc. And so it's supporting biodiversity all the way up that pyramid that I showed earlier, which is really important for long-term resilience. There are also trees that we can call wolf trees. These are trees with cavities and crazy looking growth forms that also provide great habitat for wildlife. We want to leave those behind as well. And then also snags are dead standing trees. As I'm showing here in this picture on the right, it has great cavities. It probably has tons of insects for birds to munch on. So again, this is great habitat that's going to support biodiversity and resilience for that ecosystem as a whole. As long as this dead standing tree isn't at risk of falling down on a structure or on you or someone else, you can leave it behind. But if it's a hazard tree, definitely want to focus on carefully removing that or getting someone else to remove that. If you don't have a lot of dead standing trees on your woods or in your woods, you can think about creating new snags for the future. One option to do this is called girdling, which I'll show an example of in just a second. But this is killing the tree as it stands. You're just removing the conducting layer of tissue underneath the bark to kill that tree and create a new snag. And we want to prioritize larger diameter trees and snags because the larger diameter for a snag means it's going to be able to support more species of wildlife. So this image here is showing someone creating a snag through girdling. So you can see that they're just using a chainsaw just to cut through that conductive tissue underneath the bark. They're using this in like a two-strip method. All right, so now moving into that third strategy of reducing and managing stress. We talked about how we can promote species diversity, structural complexity. And when I'm talking here now in this third strategy about reducing and managing stress, we're also going to learn a little bit more about how we can promote a diversity of different tree ages at the same time. But when we talk about stress and what it means when a tree is stressed, I first want to define growing space. So growing space are just the resources and physical space that trees need to grow. So this is light, water, and nutrients. And as land stewards, as we're making management decisions, what we're doing is we're really managing this growing space to promote the health and resilience of the stand. Because we want to make sure that those trees are able to access the growing space that they need in order to be healthy and productive. And that will support the resilience of that forest as a whole. So first, a resilient tree is going to be able to access enough growing space, so light, water, and nutrients and physical space, in order to allocate its resources appropriately. Trees have a priority list in terms of where they put their energy towards. So here's a tree that I'm showing. It's open grown. It has a pretty large crown. It's growing pretty wide. Here's another example of a very dense stand of trees. We can see that the crowns of those trees are very small. The trees are looking pretty spindly. And in terms of thinking about how trees allocate their growth, they're always going to want to grow up, so vertical growth, before they put on their diameter growth, so growing out. And so we can know that a tree is stressed and not getting the growing space that it needs if it has this really small crown, which is what we would call the live crown ratio, which is just comparing the size of that live crown to the total height of the tree. When it has a smaller live crown ratio, that means that tree is suppressed and it's not getting the growing space that it needs. So let's consider the situation on the right, where this is a very dense stand of trees. We can see that those trees are not getting the growing space that they need. What would we do in this situation to reduce the amount of stress and promote resilience for this stand of trees? So we could consider implementing a strategy such as thinning, where we remove some of those stressed and poor health trees to make sure that the remaining trees in the stand are getting the growing space that they need in order to be healthy and resilient. So this can mean just going out and removing some of those suppressed trees to favor the growth of the healthiest dominant trees in that stand. So that's an example of what we call thinning, where the goal of thinning in the stand is to promote the health of that stand. And just to visualize this concept of thinning, so this is showing a tree cookie, and here we're seeing tree rings. So with tree rings, the size of the tree rings correlates to the amount of growth in that year. So a really small growth ring means that it didn't put on much growth at all that year. Because remember that a tree wants to grow up before it puts on this diameter growth. And so when we look at the center of the tree at the pith, and as we go out for pretty like the first half or so of maybe of this tree's life, we can see those growth rings were really small. But then these managers went in there and implemented a thinning where they removed some of the unhealthy trees to favor the health of the rest of the trees in the stand. And after that thinning occurred, we can see that the size of the growth rings increased dramatically, meaning that this tree was suddenly able to take a deep breath. It was able to access the growing space that it needed, and it was finally able to allocate its resources to that diameter growth. So this means that the stress on that tree went down significantly after that thinning, and this is going to be a healthier, more resilient tree. And as we're thinking about stewardship strategies to make sure all of these trees are getting the growing space that they need, we really can think about trying to emulate that natural disturbance that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So when we're opening up growing space, we're promoting the health and resilience of individual trees and supporting the resilience of that ecosystem as a whole. And there are a lot of different tools in our toolbox that we can use to emulate natural disturbance. And so we can call these silvicultural strategies. The first silvicultural strategy that I'm going to talk about is single tree selection. So this is where we are removing single trees from the stand. We're creating these small openings that are letting in a small amount of light to support the regeneration of our shade tolerant or shade loving species in the stand. And this is also going to help support creating multiple age classes because this is emulating natural disturbances that would just kill off individual trees. And we're creating this patchwork of different ages and species throughout the stand. Another strategy that we can use to emulate natural disturbance and support resilience is called group selection. So this just means that we're creating different sized canopy gaps in the woods. So this is going to be letting in more light compared to single tree selection. This is emulating the impacts maybe of insects and disease or small scale blowdowns, for example. So again, we're emulating that natural disturbance. This picture here is showing group selection where they created this canopy gap. Then they also thinned in between those canopy gaps. So they were able to promote multiple different age classes through group selection while also opening up growing space and promoting the health and resilience of this stand. One last tool that I'll highlight, and I'll recognize there are many other tools in our toolbox that we can use. But one last tool that I'll highlight is called a shelter wood. So with a shelter wood, this is where we are removing a large proportion of the canopy, so emulating a large scale disturbance, but we're leaving behind the healthiest trees to provide shelter and seed to help regenerate the next generation of trees in that stand. So this is going to be favoring some more shade intolerant species, so those light loving species. And this is going to help create this species and age class diversity in this stand. So these are just a few examples of silvicultural strategies that we can use to emulate natural disturbance, open up growing space, and reduce stress in that stand, which is in the long term is going to support resilience. As I'm coming to the end of my presentation, just a couple things that I want to mention that I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on. I just want to mention that when it comes to reducing stress, a big stressor a lot of times in our forests is invasive species. So if you're dealing with invasive species, maybe that's buckthorn or garlic mustard or tansy, you're going to want to prioritize trying to mitigate the density of those invasive species as much as you can, because these invasives are going to outcompete our natives. And so trying to triage and focus on reducing the amount of invasives in that stand is going to be a really important first step to promoting diversity and reducing stress for this forest. And then just being aware of forest health issues that may be impacting your woods in your region specifically. So, for example, emerald ash borer or oak wilt are two non-native insects and diseases that I mentioned earlier. Being aware of when EAB activity is high or whether or not it's safe to prune oaks. This is really important to consider when we're thinking about protecting forest health for our woods and promoting long-term resilience. Spruce budworm is a native insect that impacts spruce fir forests in the Northeast. Um, Last year, me and my colleague Sarah Waddle released a new guide for landowners focused on spruce budworm. You can access it using the C link, which we'll send in the chat. But just being aware of these forest health issues that may impact your woods is really important because when you're aware of it, you can create a plan and you can go forward with those stewardship strategies, especially when you're able to work with a natural resource professional. My last few slides, I just want to highlight a couple resources that I recommend. One is this resource that was created by U of M Extension and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and others. This is called Keep Your Woods Healthy for Tomorrow. And this has some really helpful scorecards that you can use to assess the resilience or vulnerability of your woods. And this is based on a lot of the same information that I was sharing today. So assessing species diversity, species suitability. It'll also talk about maybe any issues that you have with flooding or drought, for example. You'll be able to go through and use this scorecard to assess the resilience of your woods. And you can access this document using this Z link here, which we'll also send in the chat. And then I also want to recommend this new book that I've been reading through, which I am really enjoying. This is from Paul Catanzaro and Anthony D'Amato out on the East Coast. And this is a guide to ecological forest stewardship. This focuses in a lot on resilience, and it's a really great read. I highly recommend checking it out. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground. So now I'm just going to summarize these core stewardship strategies that I've talked about today. First, knowing your woods, making a plan and being flexible. Maybe that's making a plan and discussing it with your family members, or it's working with a natural resource professional to get a stewardship plan written. And then really focusing in on building that relationship with your woods and having that reciprocal relationship. Building diversity and complexity by encouraging a diversity of species and tree ages, and leaving behind that dead wood and dead standing trees to support the resilience of the ecosystem by supporting biodiversity. And then finally, reducing and managing stressors. So the core part of this is opening up growing space. We talked about some of those strategies. Mitigating invasive species as much as we can. I know that's easier said than done. And then finally, understanding and being aware of those forest health impacts that could stress out your forest. Now, in my second to last slide, I just want to mention two really exciting programs that are coming up from the Extension Forestry team. One, I'm going to be delivering a cohort of the Minnesota Woodland Steward program focused around the Iron Range. This cohort is really going to drill down on what it means to promote resilient forests, and management strategies for that. That's going to be starting on February 23rd. I'll include the link for that on the next slide. And then also the Extension Forestry team, we're going to be hosting the Minnesota Family Woodlands Conference on March 13th and 14th. I checked this morning and there are only 10 spots left. So I highly recommend that if you're thinking about registering, that you do it sooner rather than later because it's very likely to sell out before the conference. And with that, now I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks so much for listening to me. Here are the Z links to those two programs that I just mentioned, and happy to take any questions. So thank you all.
Anna, let's keep your slides up for sharing, please, in
Okay.
case you have to go back to answer some of those questions real quickly. And I'm going to read those to you really quickly here. We have, are you aware of any long-term research at St. Croix State Park where there's huge blowdown? Let's see, 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. How is the forest recovering? How is the park staff manipulating that recovery, e.g. white pine restoration?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm not aware of that research, but I'd love to look into that. being on a state park, that makes it unique in terms of stewardship strategy. So I'd love to look into that. So thank you for that note.
Another question, is there any type of climate-ready woodlands for Wisconsin?
So I don't think that there is an exact program like what we have here in Minnesota in Wisconsin, but I highly recommend going to the University of Wisconsin Extension website. I was just talking with someone from their forestry team yesterday, and they're building a climate hub for forest stewardship. So they're going to be putting a lot of great resources there in terms of climate-informed forest stewardship.
You have to protect seedlings from other species like rabbits.
Yeah, great question. And yeah, absolutely. There are many other species other than deer that can feed on and impact seedlings. And on the extension website, we have a whole page dedicated to protecting trees from animal damage. So that includes deer, rabbits, and other species as well, because rabbits will love to feed, like chew on the base of the tree, and that can have big impacts. If you would know that that's an issue, you might need to think about that as well.
How does diversity work with the concept of climax forest that will continue to replicate itself?
Yeah, I love that question. So typically, when we refer to a climax forest, what that means is like an old growth, mature forest. So it has a really complex structure where it has multiple age classes, it has dead standing trees and dead logs. And even in one of those climax forests, as we're referring to it, there's still going to be this cycle of disturbance. It can be happening on multiple scales. So maybe it's individual trees dying and then creating a canopy gap, which then lets in light and promotes regrowth on the forest floor. It can be a larger scale disturbance, such as a blowdown or insect and disease outbreak. So even in these really old climax forests, that cycle of disturbance is still occurring. And it happens on multiple scales. It doesn't have to be a big disturbance. It can be really small scale. So just to emphasize that even those climax forests are still dynamic, diversity is changing through time as those disturbances occur.
Here's an urban question on EAB. You may want to contact your city forester on this question, but what is being done about EAB in urban communities causing homeowners major financial problems that lead to some homeowners losing their homes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, like Gary said, every community is going to be different, and so I recommend getting in touch with your city forester to learn more
Mhm.
about it. But really, strategies are going to vary based on the community. Some communities are treating ash trees, others are removing, or any mix of these different strategies. So it's hard to answer, but I recommend getting in touch with the city forester wherever you're located.
There's the question on the book you recommended, Anna. What is the book you mentioned towards the end?
Great question. So let me go back. So it's called Tending Your Forest, a guide to ecological forest stewardship. And I can leave this up in case people want to write down the title and authors.
Okay. And if I don't get into all the questions, we'll show Anna's email address later too, as
Yep.
well. How much blowdown should you leave on the forest floor for structure? And then we have lots of spruce budworm cause blowdown.
Yeah, so again, a really great question. And of course, there's a balance that you want to strike because if we leave behind too much dead wood, that increases our risk of catastrophic fire. Even though I mentioned, fire is an integral part of the landscape, we still want to be thinking about reducing our fuel load on the landscape because that can impact our communities, our forests, et cetera. And so typically when we're thinking about that dead wood, it's good to prioritize larger diameter logs, leaving those behind, and some tops and limbs of those trees, for example. But you don't want to be leaving behind a ton of slash. So there is a balance. And with spruce budworm specifically, I know that there's probably a lot of slash that you're dealing with. So you could consider piling some of that. You could consider burning some of those piles and distributing some of it. And it's really tricky to say like exact amounts. And so that's where it's great to get in touch with a natural resource professional, for example, through the Soil and Water Conservation District. Because especially in the Northeast where we have those fire dependent landscapes, we want to make sure that we're being smart about the amount of fuel that we're leaving behind in the woods.
Thank you, Anna. We're learning more about prescribed burns and the benefit of to ecosystems. Is there any scenario that a prescribed burn would be beneficial in woods rather than rangeland or prairie? Is it ever safe?
Yeah, another really great question. And I want to preface this that I'm not a fire ecologist or an expert in prescribed fire. But as I've mentioned a few times in this presentation, many of our forests in Minnesota are fire dependent, meaning that they rely on fire to maintain their identity and support regeneration. And there are many instances of where prescribed fire has been implemented in our forests here in Minnesota to support forest health and resilience. For example, my office is here at the Cloquet Forestry Center, and staff here at the Cloquet Forestry Center, in partnership with the Fond du Lac Band, have been implementing prescribed fires in the red pine stands here at the Cloquet Forestry Center that are fire dependent. And so, when done thoughtfully in an informed way and through professionals, prescribed fire can be really successful. But this is something that I really, really, really recommend working with a professional on. You need a permit to do it. There's a lot of different considerations in terms of liability and risk. But it is a tool in our toolbox, and recommend talking to a professional if it's something that you're considering.
Question about sharing resources about prescribed fire. I know the DNR has some websites on prescribed fire. I'm not sure if Extension, our website, hasn't much on that. And actually, there's groups around the state of Minnesota that are forming that will do and help landowners with prescribed burns and so forth. And even local fire departments will help you with that. But yeah, do reach out to the DNR on that question. If you have anything to comment, Anna, go ahead.
No,
Uh,
go ahead.
there's
Go ahead.
some websites mentioned in the uh, question and answer area too. You can look at. Do you have references for creating a conservation easement for riparian forest? What should be done in what should be in the document specified to maintenance?
Yeah, so for people who are unaware, a conservation easement permanently protects your land from development. So it permanently keeps your forest as a forest. In terms of what would need to go into that individual documentation, I wouldn't be able to speak on that. There are multiple different organizations that do conservation easements through the state. So that could be through the state of Minnesota or organizations such as the Minnesota Land Trust. So what goes into that documentation is really going to vary based on who you're working through with the conservation easement. And I don't know enough about conservation easements to talk about those specific components that go into the plans.
This person has a sandy ridge around wet meadow that has a large amount of box elder that is dying. We have been replacing the variety of trees with a variety of trees, but the box elder is positive, or let's see, is the box elder a positive or for anything? I think it's a cavity tree, I'd say. It's certainly a wildlife potential.
Yeah, I agree with Gary, and I would say that I think, every native species in an ecosystem has some type of benefit for a different being in the ecosystem. So box elder, provides benefits for wildlife. In a wetland, it's supporting hydrology, so meaning it's pulling up water with its roots and transpiring it back out to out to the atmosphere. So it definitely does have value. Why it's dying is maybe it's just, it's at that stage in that ecosystem's life cycle, or what we call succession, where it's just being replaced by some other native species as that ecosystem goes through change. But I would say it definitely has value.
Thank you, Anna. Uh, are there any ongoing studies for EAB resistant varieties of ash?
Great question. And Gary, maybe you have something to add here too, but I mean, I know that there is research ongoing. I think it's
Yes.
blue ash, which is native to more like central, like the central US, has possibilities of potentially being somewhat resistant, but I'm not an expert in this area. And like I know there are non-native ashes that they've done research on. Gary, do you have anything you want to add here?
I think there's studies being developed and maybe looking at more resistant varieties of ash, but nothing developed yet.
Yeah.
Another ash tree question. We have an ash tree that has animal ash borer. Is it necessary to remove the tree or just to let it die on its own since the woodpeckers like to feast on it?
Yeah, so this is going to depend on one, if that ash tree is it close to a house, can it risk like damaging you or another structure, and also where you're located in the state. So like if you're in an area that's what they call generally infested by emerald ash borer, it's less of a priority to remove it, assuming it's not a hazard tree. So it's really going to depend on where you are and if that tree is causing a hazard. Anything you want to add on that, Gary, as a fellow like EAB person?
Exactly. If it's a hazard tree, you've got to remove it. If not, then certainly if it's out in the woods and not going to affect any structures or people, then you could probably just let it go. Yeah. Here's a question. I am in central Minnesota and have primarily red oak and large, small pockets of oak wilt, dead trees. I am wondering what is the best way or best strategy is for that environment.
Yeah. So with this, with oak wilt, prevention is the most important thing. So making sure not to wound oaks during the summer when oak wilt, when the beetles that are the vectors for oak wilt are active. So trying to prevent wounding new oaks. If you do need to wound those oaks, making sure to cover them. Um, and so that's going to be the most important thing. But I would highly recommend getting in touch with a local forester to help you walk through some of those management strategies for oak, because it's going to depend on, how much red oak, white oak you have, and some of those other factors. And like I mentioned earlier, my colleague Grace Haynes, who I think I saw earlier on the call, will be talking more about oak wilt, I believe, in a future webinar. And we also have more resources on our website.
The question about wood chipping. Can wood chipping or leaving the wood chips in the forest be another or additional method if there is a large amount of dead logs in your private woods?
Sure. Yeah. So wood chipping and then distributing the wood chips in your woods is definitely an option. The only thing with that is wood chips are going to decompose much faster than dead logs. So meaning that they won't. So that's good for putting nutrients back in the soil, but wood chips aren't going to be providing the same wildlife value that a large log would provide. So there's pros and cons there, but it's definitely a good option if you're dealing with a lot of dead wood and you can't leave all of it behind.
We're getting close to 10. I think we're not answering all the questions. So if you want to stop sharing, Anna, I'll start again here. Let's see. Get back here. Screen two. Um, I'll show Anna's email is there. Is that full screen, Lauren, Anna?
Yep, looks good.
And all of our Zoom presentations are recorded on a Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. So if we didn't get some of your questions, you can email Anna directly or myself or Lauren. This is the rest of our list for our Fridays with the Forester coming up this season, going clear down to April 22nd, 24th. And yeah, here's another web link for the Minnesota Family Woodlands Conference that Anna mentioned, March 13th and 14th at Collegeville. And you'll get a short evaluation after you leave the Zoom today. If you could fill that out for us, we'd appreciate it. And here's some other Z links. If you're not getting the My Minnesota Woods monthly newsletter from our forestry team for extension, you certainly can access it there. There's another link for the Minnesota Family Woodland Conference as well. And again, all of our recordings for Fridays with a Forester are at a Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. Anna, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today on Fridays with a Forester. And thank everyone for joining us as well. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.